So nitrous oxide it's a greenhouse gas. It's also a bit of a double whammy because it's also an ozone depleter. And people have been measuring this gas, not just in Australia but worldwide, for decades. Initially, the interest was because they were concerned that it represented a significant loss of their nitrogen fertiliser, but more recently there's been concerns about how it might be contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately possibly to the carbon footprint of grains production. So in Western Australia, we've found that after 10 years of studies in various sites in our mid to low rainfall zones, that the emissions are really low in comparison to what's been applied as nitrogen fertiliser. For example, we've never measured anything more than, say, 0.15% of the nitrogen that's been applied in any year.
Yeah, and I mean, in the north we've had larger emissions than you have in terms of nitrous oxide, but the emissions are still small, generally under 1% of the applied nitrogen, typically in that 0.5 to 1% range. I guess from our perspective, one of the interesting things we've found though is that not only is nitrous oxide a greenhouse gas, but it's also an indicator of other loss pathways. And some of those loss pathways represent a much bigger loss of nitrogen than we measure as nitrous oxide. So we might measure 1 to 2 kilos of nitrous oxide nitrogen leaving in a 12-month period in summer sorghum cropping, but we might measure 20 to 40% of our applied nitrogen being lost through other gas pathways. And that's for summer sorghum cropping in the north.
Yeah, and sort of similarly in the Victorian work, some of the work in Horsham that Ash Wallace undertook was sort of measuring losses ranging from 20 to 45% of the applied nitrogen, so that's in a medium rainfall area, whereas some of the work that Rob Harris undertook at Hamilton, which is a 750 annual rainfall but really high background soil nitrogen and carbon levels, he's recorded losses of up to 85% of the nitrogen fertiliser as urea that was applied at sowing. So really big financial implications for grain growers in these regions.
And I think just for people who aren't familiar with the process, it really depends on that coincidence of wet soils, lots of labile carbon or residue and microbial activity and nitrogen that's not taken up by the crop. So if you've got to have all those things at the same time for these loss pathways to be significant. So in Roger's example, where you've got soils coming out of pastures, high carbon in a wet zone, nitrogen applied, ticks all the boxes, and you can get some spectacular losses. Our clay soils in the north, they can get very wet, tend to have lower carbon, so we don't have the losses that Roger can get in some of his pasture situations. But if we're double cropping and we've got a lot of stubble, again, it's a high risk process for us.
Yeah, and I do think some people sometimes do forget that it's a natural process that's happening in the soil. It's happening as a result of microbes going about their everyday business. You guys have mentioned that that's stimulated by the addition of nitrogen fertiliser in partnership with there being a lot of carbon in the soil and potentially moisture. But we do have to be aware of the fact that carbon is good for our soils. And in Western Australia, we're not renowned for having a lot of carbon. We have found that on our sandy soils that whilst increasing the soil organic matter in our soils increases the N2O emissions, they're still relatively low by international and national standards.
And the benefits far outweigh any of those risks.
I think you sort of raised one point there that when you have these losses either as nitrous oxide or through denitrification, some of the work that Anna has undertaken at Hamilton has shown it's just not fertiliser-based nitrogen that can be lost, but also legume-based nitrogen. So in the case of Oksana's work at Hamilton, they're coming out of grassy legume pastures, and once they're cultivated prior to cropping, they're very high background soil nitrates, they're high background labile carbon levels, and as a result of that sort of tillage, you're getting extreme amounts of mineralisation occurring, and that's sort of underpinning the losses of that nitrate, both through nitrous oxide, and we also probably assume through denitrification in those environments.
So, Roger, in your environment, what's sort of that take-home message that you'd be saying to growers in terms of nitrous oxide and minimising those losses?
I think the key message for growers in both the medium rainfall areas such as the Wimmera, where soil nitrate levels and soil moisture is low, but potentially you can have waterlogging situations because of the high clay soils, and also in the higher rainfall zone around Hamilton, is measure your soil nitrogen. There's no point adding very large amounts of fertiliser in if you've already got high background soil mineral N levels there, because you're basically going to lose a large proportion of it. So there is a cost of soil sampling, but there's a bigger cost of losing that nitrogen.
And in the north, I think one of the key messages that we don't have enough legumes in our cropping system by and large, but if we did have legumes we could incorporate, we've been able to show that having a legume in the rotation, you reduce the fertiliser nitrogen input, but you also reduce the amount of emissions we get from a similar sized sorghum crop, for example, because that legume nitrogen, there's less carbon associated with the legume residues. That nitrogen doesn't accumulate as quickly as from a fertiliser, so our risk profile is lowered and we have less emissions per tonne of grain produced. So strategies like that, I think, you come back to the farming system, the soil testing, understanding how your system works and trying to tweak the components of it, we can reduce emissions and improve our nitrogen use efficiency at the same time.
Well, in the west, I'd be saying, growers, keep doing what you're doing. Apply the amount of fertiliser that you think you need to meet your crop demand on a season-by-season basis. Don't be scared about increasing your soil carbon, because the chances are that your emissions are very low, and that's great because it means the carbon footprint of your grain production is, by world standards, quite low too.
And I think that there's one key message that's come out of the whole of the NANL program over the last decade now, is that good nitrogen management, adopting practices that improve nitrogen use efficiency is a win-win in terms of both sort of financial benefits to the grains industry, but also in terms of reduced emissions and therefore benefits to the environment.